Hello and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to talk about a psychological concept called the fantasy bond by Robert Firestone. And as Carl Jung said, but perhaps not in these exact words, but pretty much in these exact words, it's just a concept, I invented it, but prove me wrong. Robert Firestone is a clinical psychologist, now in his 90s, who worked alongside R.D. Laing. Laing actually wrote the introduction to the fantasy bond, which is his major work. So a fantasy bond is a primitive defense mechanism for an illusion of safety. It usually involves idealizing the parent. It doesn't have to be the parent, but in most cases it's the parent at the child's own expense. The child sees themselves as fundamentally bad or unlovable to cope with the fact that it's actually their parents that are inadequate. It's a defense mechanism. It's cope. They're coping. They are imagining that they are able to sustain themselves in what is actually a hostile environment. And it doesn't have to be overtly hostile. It doesn't have to. In most cases it's very, very subtle. It doesn't have to be capital T trauma. It's just a point of misconnection which actually becomes extremely painful. You know, they feel this connection internally with an idealized image of this person, but in reality there's nothing. In reality we're unable to depend on real intimacy or real involvement with the parent or with anybody else. Introjecting the image of the good and powerful mother or father, as the case may be. It's the way that they had to form to survive in this hostile, and I mean hostile in the sense of organic life and flourishing, not actively hostile. You know, you didn't have to be slapped around. I mean, you could have been, that's possible, but it doesn't mean that that was actually the case. You have to conceive of the family or the person that they've internalized in this bond as totally ideal or irreproachable, or at least idealistic. Perhaps they are aware of some flaws they can criticize. Perhaps they actually actively hate or resent this person. But for the sake of the fantasy bond and the illusion of being able to sustain themselves, to sustain an identity which was basically foisted upon them, they didn't, you know, this isn't an identity that has developed through serious integration with self, others, world. It's just kind of a conglomerate. You internalize the good mother, you probably also internalize her bad aspects as well, a rejecting attitude, dismissive towards your feelings, dismissive towards you as a person, dismissive towards perhaps afraid of real intimacy with you due to their personal problems, or because it brings out a side of them that they are uncomfortable with. But these bad aspects, they take ownership of them. They feel that this is them, and then the good is the parent, because it means then that the feelings which were suppressed when this fantasy was created, what it was created to block, to control and to keep away from the person, all of these feelings are re-aroused and they're brought back. Most people don't want to be vulnerable again, and they try to avoid even positive experiences because it would bring again a threat to the fantasy, to this inner world, this inner idea. So they may deliberately provoke rejection or disappoint people. You know, hating themselves allows them to sustain this microcosm. You see this fantasy bond in families a lot, where people deny a primary desperation, a hunger for connection and pain, and instead seem to subsist on imaginary connections which aren't really there, like an imagined connection to the family, to family members, which don't really, you know, in reality there's no tangible, substantial connection. You know, people in this inward state, in this fantasy bond, also project their fear and their anger onto other people as a way of keeping them away from this, and so they tend to avoid them because it's the only thing they can do. Having to react with genuine feeling or emotion brings somebody out of an inward state, and sometimes this can be very effective. Other times it can cause further withdrawal because it threatens this inward state, this bond, this sense of self, this identity, and again causes all this anxiety. Even if they overtly hate their parents, they may internally have this idealized thing or have tried to follow an ideal path set out by their parents, doing the same things their parents did, studying the same subject, trying to please them in some way, to the decimation of absolutely anything or anybody else. Their parents may seem as these extremely powerful figures, but then in themselves they are unlovable, weak, shameful. Any kind of positive change would involve a loss of a sense of self, and this is the case for a lot of people. It doesn't have to be the most objectively laid out, fitting every criteria as explained in Firestone, as explained here, of a fantasy bond. Maybe you don't even need to call it a fantasy bond, but this is in effect how it works for anybody. You know, people resist positive change because they don't want to lose a sense of self. Yeah, and the motivation of most people as they go through life is to avoid punishment by authorities, whether it's parents or anybody else. You know, generally to avoid punishment in society or by other people. Any kind of behaviour, not as real self-gratification from a strong point, but how can I avoid being punished? How can I avoid this being thrown back onto me? It's very difficult to get the kind of reality testing necessary to have an integrated self, to have a person which experiences from a strong sense of self rather than to be in an inward state. This is the case for a lot of society. It doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be a clinical fantasy bond. They'll often play the victim to avoid a sense of shame and have a really strong sort of scary identification with the same-sex parent as a way of keeping them close. They may imitate the way that they dress, the way they behave, the way they speak. They give up themselves in exchange for a fantasy bond with the parent. They give up intimacy in exchange for a fantasy bond with an idealized other. They give up on themselves as well, because intimacy really is the becoming of the self. It's a way of becoming integrated and whole as another person, of breaking through your own parameters, your own boundaries, your own transgressing yourself in order to take in more and to become more and to journey as a person and to be able to experience life and carry the life force or the love of God, or you know, you can call it anything, but it's the experiencing self. You know, if existence precedes essence, then you're carrying your experience in that case. You know, if even the essence of the self isn't changing in this exchange, then your experience is growing and changing and developing you. So whatever you believe, transgressing the self in intimate relations with others is absolutely necessary. Try having a life without friends. I did for a very long time. I didn't have friends, I didn't have intimacy, I didn't have family for a very long time. All my own faults, nobody else's fault, my fault. But yeah, try living like that and see what happens, see how diminished your life becomes.